let's go straight to the daily dose of stupid.
No, you messed it up. You're stupid.
Okay, today's daily dose of stupid, it revolves around guns, because there are a lot of dumb arguments when it comes to guns, but this may be one of the dumber ones, and that is saying something. I've always said for a long time, guns are one of the few issues that almost all the research, all the legitimate, studies that have been done on it, all the stats, all the facts happen to be on one side of the argument, and that is the pro-gun argument. And so it's really funny, some of the really bad arguments that get used here. And this particular one comes from a actual Democrat presidential candidate. You may not have known that there were any yet, but yes, a guy from California, Representative Eric Swalwell, has announced that he is going to run for the presidency on the Democrat side in 2020. And so even though that's a ways off, he has already announced, and the truth is, the second one is probably not too far off. I'm guessing somewhere around February, maybe March, we're going to have another Democrat presidential candidate. But nonetheless, so this guy, Swalwell, he got into this confrontation with a screenwriter named Joe Biggs, who was tweeting about how he'd never sell his gun in a buyback, because that's one of Swalwell's policies, is he believes in gun buybacks. And so Joe Biggs gets into this argument with him. They go back and forth, and he's saying, well, I would never sell my gun in a buyback, which is a sentiment I understand. I'm the same way. You could offer me all kinds of money for my gun for a government buyback. I would never sell it. I'm not going to disarm myself willingly. And so he was kind of reflecting the same sentiment that a lot of gun owners have. So Swalwell, when this happened, it's important to understand that the buyback program that he's talking about, when it was done in Europe and Australia, the buybacks were mandatory. Now in America, there have been some minor attempts to do buybacks. There's one right here in the city of Montgomery. I think maybe 5-6 guns every time they do it, which is like twice a year. So maybe a dozen guns a year. Now it doesn't do anything to curb crime, because the people that are criminals that want to use their guns to do bad things, they're not going to give up their guns. It doesn't do anything for the lawful gun owner. The only one that usually winds up showing up to this stuff are little old ladies that are selling off their husband's gun collection or something like that. You do occasionally have that. But as far as the gun buybacks, there's very little success. There's no statistic whatsoever that shows that they actually reduce gun crimes. In fact, usually the cities that have these buyback programs are the ones that have the highest gun crime rates. So at the same time, there's been no evidence whatsoever that this does anything to solve gun violence. But nonetheless, this is Swalwell's big pitch. This is his big plan. And when Europe and Australia did the same thing, their buybacks were mandatory. In other words, it wasn't really a buyback. It was a confiscation and compensation, which I guess is kind of theoretically better than just taking your gun from you. But it's just taking your gun from you by force and then giving you money for it, which I'd rather have the money than not have the money. But let's not pretend that this was anything other than a gun confiscation. And by the way, speaking of that, later, when Swalwell actually was accused of being someone who favored gun confiscation, straight up confiscation, he replied to that tweet with agreed. And he's also made comments about that in the past, that at the very least, assault weapons should be confiscated from people forcibly. No grandfathering in, none of that. That we should go out and actually take guns from people. So this is the kind of person he is when it comes to gun policy. He believes in taking people's guns away from them, even if they had bought them legally at one point. So that started this whole little tirade, and he tweets back one of the dumbest gun arguments out there. Let's go ahead and look at this tweet. Okay, this is Representative Eric Swalwell, and it would be a short war, my friend. The government has nukes, too many of them, but they're legit. I'm sure that if we talked, we could find common ground to protect our families and communities. Okay, so a couple of things. First of all, he's saying, I don't even like nukes. I don't agree with nukes, but we're totally going to use nukes against gun owners if we started a war. That's stupid on a multitude of levels. First of all, this is the reason that it's one of the dumbest anti-gun arguments that there is. First of all, nobody nukes a place they want to control. If you are an oppressive government and you want to control the land, you want to control the people, you don't nuke your own country. Does he really think the people in Washington are going to say, oh, we're having all these trouble with gun owners out in, I don't know, Minnesota or Alabama. I think we're going to have to nuke them. Okay, click. That's not going to happen because they want to own the land. I mean, they could theoretically, but then the only land they would control would be worthless nuclear wasteland. And so it would do them no good. The only people that you nuke are enemies that you don't want their land, that you don't care what happens to their land. You just want them gone. And so you can't control people that are dead. And second of all, is he really going to nuke gun owners? Because nukes are not like pinpoint accurate missiles or anything like that. When you nuke a city, the whole city gets nuked whether they supported the Second Amendment or not. And so it would be very hard to distinguish between gun owners and non-gun owners if that were to take place, or even gun owners that weren't rebelling at that point. But nonetheless, if here's the issue that's underlying this, and this is the beauty of the Second Amendment. You're not going to be able to nuke and wholesale wipe out your own population. Now, it's possible that some other country could nuke us, but they're not going to do it. If you don't believe me, read Mockingjay. Mockingjay, it's a fictional book. It's in the Hunger Games series. The reason that they didn't nuke that particular area, and I won't say it because it would give away spoilers. Maybe there's somebody somewhere that doesn't know the story. Not only would that not do anything, but it doesn't help the government that does the nuking because they want to control the facility. You cannot destroy that which you want to conquer and control, whether it be people or a location, facilities, resources, whatever it is. You don't nuke that which you want. And so that what they would have to do is they would have to come in manually. Now, granted, the military has fully automatic weapons, and they have all kinds of other resources that could take out an area. But the point is they would still have to go in manually. And when that happens, who do you think is better equipped to take on that military force? Now, are they as well equipped as the military force invading? No, but they are better equipped than they would be if you took their guns away. And so that is the idea here. So even if there were, let's just say it was a foreign nation. Let's just say China, I'll just use some random country, decided to invade the state of Alabama. Do you have any idea how long, even with superior military hardware, it would take to take the city of Wetumpka and Millbrook and Montgomery and Clanton and Prattville? I mean, it would take them a week or 2 weeks to take every little podunk town in Alabama because there's guns everywhere and people that know how to use them. Now, would they be able to take it over and be able to win a lot of battles and probably kill more of our people than we would theirs? Yeah, but the point is, that would slow them down considerably. You march into a town without guns, you control that town basically automatically. And so when you have armed resistance, when you have people that actually have somewhat of a fighting chance, even if the equipment isn't exactly on par, it's way better than what they would be unarmed. And so because of that, it would take forever to conquer America because of that. It would take forever to conquer this country, considering you've got 400 million guns and several hundred million gun owners. We don't know the exact numbers, but the point is, it's a lot. You had that Japanese general during World War II that said they never even contemplated invading California, invading the mainland of America, because they said there would be a gun behind every bush, and they were right. It is a deterrent against tyrannical forces, because it would take so long. And here's what I find hilarious about this. Liberals will always make the argument, and it's a good argument, one that I think they actually have a good point on, that we don't need to be getting involved in other countries because it's a quagmire. So whether you're talking about Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, we don't need to be getting involved in those countries because it's a quagmire. Okay, well, those militaries, especially the rebel forces, they use guerrilla tactics. They don't have tanks. They don't have fighter jets. And yet, somehow, the American military, the greatest military force in the history of mankind, has had a really hard time wiping out every pocket of resistance. Why? Because they are armed and because they know the land, which presumably would be exactly the same problem if the American military tried to become tyrannical and rule over the American people. they would be facing pockets of resistance. They would be stuck in a quagmire over here too. And so liberals cannot simultaneously make the argument that it's a quagmire and we're never going to be able to do anything with it and we'd never be able to actually conquer that country, be it Iraq, Vietnam, whatever, because there would be pockets of resistance and people with guns and armed resistance, and then simultaneously say, but in America, that would totally not work, even though we have more guns and far better equipment and people that are better trained in it than they do. Guns are not a commonplace item in the Middle East. They're just common amongst the terrorists because they make it a point to get them. In America, a lot, especially in the South, a lot of everyday citizens are armed, which would make it even more difficult to take over here. And so this argument that, well, you wouldn't be able to stand against the American military, A, well, we'd have a much better chance with guns than without the guns, and B, at that point, you can't make that argument that it would be a quagmire, it would be impossible to take over, and then also make exactly the same argument but in reverse and say, but it would never work in America. We're better equipped than they are to handle that. And so that really is something that he doesn't seem to have really a big handle on. If the Middle East has all these unwinnable wars, then why would it be so easy to win and easy to conquer the Americans who have guns? The answer is it wouldn't be. There's no system of logic underlying that or no rational thought. So let's look at a follow-up tweet that he had. This is basically him taking a step back and analyzing the debate. So he says, America's gun debate in one thread. I propose a buyback of assault weapons. We've already dealt with that. Gun owner says he'd go to war with the USA if that happens. We already established that too. I sarcastically point out that the USA isn't losing to his assault weapon. It's not the 18th century. I'm called a tyrant. Zero progress. So probably not an altogether unfair characterization of the argument, but he also didn't disprove any of the arguments made against him in doing so. So again, when it comes to the buyback, there's no evidence that it has ever actually worked. Criminals don't participate in buybacks, and so the only people that wind up doing so are legal gun owners that don't really want their guns. And so the only way to do that would be manual confiscation. And if that happened, just like it did in Australia, just like it did in England, actually in the UK, I think gun crime went up about 30% in the initial years after that buyback, and then it started tapering off, but still it just now got back to the levels that it was before the confiscation. So it did no good, cost all kinds of money. And if you were to equate that, because we have way more guns than they did, let's be conservative. Let's guess that roughly half the guns in the country would qualify as assault weapons under his proposed policy. So that's about 200 million. So if we've got 200 million guns, and the thing is, if they are assault rifles, if they're the quality firearms that he's talking about, let's be uber conservative and guess that they would be valued on average around $1,200. Because I can tell you, a lot of the people that have assault, what he would call assault weapons, even though they're really not, if you were to take a price of each part and how much it would cost in a buyback, you're running about $2,000 a weapon. But let's be conservative. Let's give him every benefit of the doubt. Let's say it's just $1,200 on average. Okay, well, that means the cost would still be $240 billion to do a buyback. And it would solve no problems. It would cost us about $250 billion. And you would wind up getting nowhere. And you're violating people's rights on top of that. And so the buyback is one of the stupidest gun programs that there is. And here's another issue that you're running into that doesn't make sense with this argument. Again, this is why it's such a bad argument. It was because it has multiple layers of stupidity, which is why it's part of the Daily Dose of Stupid. Either assault weapons are these uber powerful military grade weapons, or they are not. That's the issue that you're running into. And this is one that they are never consistent on. They'll always say when they're talking about mass shootings, for example, that anybody can pick these up and basically become Rambo right away. That they're so easy to use that any idiot can pick up a gun and become a mass killer. And then, by that same extension, when you're talking about using them for home defense, they'll say, well, they're just so hard to use and you're better off using a shotgun. That was Joe Biden that made that argument. Well, they're either easy to use or they're not. And the same thing goes for their level of power. They'll always say that the reason we have to confiscate assault weapons is because they're so powerful and so dangerous, and they can basically make anybody a god who just decides who lives and dies with a squeeze of his finger. These are very powerful weapons, and I don't deny that. But they'll say that exact same thing, and then when they say, but they wouldn't do any good against the American military. Well, if you're saying they're military-grade weapons and that they're so powerful, but against the American military they wouldn't do anything, you can't have it both ways. Either these are very powerful guns that are so powerful that they're too dangerous to be held by citizens, even responsible law-abiding citizens, or they're worthless and basically having them wouldn't do you any good if the American military decided to become tyrannical. You have to pick one. You can't make both arguments at the same time. And furthermore, we'll just get to his last point. He's upset that he's been called a tyrant, which he should. That is a cut down. But let's look at the Webster definition of tyrant. Tyrant, an absolute ruler, unrestrained by law or constitution. Well, to confiscate someone's guns like that, he would, by definition, be violating a constitution and the law of the land. And he would be doing so in an oppressive way. So, and I looked at 3 or 4 different definitions that Webster had of tyrant. Every single one of them, somebody that was taking guns would fit that qualification. And let's not forget, our very first act as a country, in the Declaration of Independence, after asserting that we had certain unalienable rights, which guns would have obviously been amongst them because that's what the founders put into the Constitution, we also asserted that King George III was a tyrant. And part of the reason we asserted that he was a tyrant is because he kept us from having weapons. In 1774, they started putting limits on how much powder and musket balls you could buy. In 1775, they started confiscating muskets. And then in 1776, we rose up against them. I mean, there was a little fighting before the Declaration of Independence. There was actually some fighting in 1775. But my point is, part of the reason we declared King George III a tyrant is because he was taking our weapons and doing so to subject us to his will. That's what a tyrant does, and that's what Swalwell is proposing here. I don't see the difference. Because tyrants always fear those who they subject with gaining power, and they don't want them to have it. That's what makes them tyrants. Because that's the fundamental thing that they don't seem to understand about the gun debate. With guns, we are citizens. Without guns, we are subjects, lambs to the slaughter.